I protected them, taught them to control their powers, and in time,
Cyclops' Origins. I'm Andrew Lapamardo, your narrator, and this is Marvelous Videos. Although the Wolverine-centric X-Men films may make it appear otherwise, Cyclops is quite possibly one of Marvel's most notable mutants. He is a Marvel hero in the purest sense, defined by his distinctive visor, and he is as strong as he is sad. Cyclops' ability to shoot optic bursts of pure concussive energy makes him a formidable opponent. But it also prevents him from ever seeing someone in the eye. He is characterized as much by the manner in which his talents restrict him as he is by their incredible uses. He is, in a nutshell, an X-Man. Spectacularly brilliant and inextricably cursed. But it wasn't always gloom and doom for this powerful hero. Cyclops has led the X-Men to unprecedented success, romanced a slew of women, and evolved into a kind and self-assured warrior, strategist, and comrade. He is one of the most steadfast members of the X-Men and among the most accomplished alumni of Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters after decades of comics. From his strange background to his emotional entanglements, the guy behind the visor is a complicated personality, but he has been given short shrift far too often. Before we go into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Cyclops' tragic backstory from Wolverine and the X-Men. Like many other Marvel characters, Cyclops has a riveting backstory, which is further explored in Season 1 of the Wolverine and X-Men's episode 20, named Breakdown. The episode opens, as much as this serial's peripheral episodes do, with the authors forsaking the primary story arc to examine one of their numerous plot lines. By the time it hits its climax, Breakdown has reached a turning point that portrays the majority of the first season in a totally new light. The episode chronicles Emma Frost's effort to remove Jean Grey's memories from Cyclops' mind, which sets off a series of flashbacks to pivotal times in Scott Summers' past. In this episode, Cyclops accidentally kisses Emma Frost, mistaking her to be Jean Grey after a battle with Juggernaut, in which their adversary unfortunately manages to get away. Cyclops apologizes to Emma and claims that he saw Jean, but Emma dismisses him and tells him it's all in his head, and that he can't blame himself for everything. Cyclops says he can and announces that he is no good for the team before making an exit. Emma asks him to stay because the team needs him, but Cyclops, whose real name is Scott, says he cannot move on with his life and become an X-Man as long as Jean is all he thinks about. Emma offers to permanently erase Jean from his memory, but Scott is afraid he will be haunted by things he doesn't know if she does that. Emma says that will not happen. As Emma asks Scott to lead her to Jean, Scott is transported to a memory of childhood in which he is in a hospital with a doctor named Dr. Brooks. Scott wishes to see his family, but the doctor calms him down and asks him about the last thing he remembers. Scott says that he and his family were going on a plane, but doesn't remember anything else. The doctor tells him that he was in a plane crash, and that he and his brother Alex were the only ones who survived. But Alex is now living with another family, since Scott has been in a coma for 2 years. The scene flashes back to the past, to Omaha Meadows Orphanage, where Scott gets into a scuffle with 2 other guys and accidentally attacks one of them with a powerful energy beam from his eyes. He cannot control his power and goes on to destroy the building with the energy beams before crying out for help. In the next scene, Scott finds himself blindfolded in a dark room, where Charles Xavier appears and introduces himself. In order to assure Scott that he is not alone, he communicates with him using telepathy. He assures the young boy that his abilities can be controlled, gives him a specialized pair of eyewear, and insists that Scott opens his eyes. Despite Scott's numerous protests, when Scott opens his eyes, he can see everything around him, and Charles Xavier takes him to a facility so that he can train his skills with the other X-Men. When Scott expresses doubt about his abilities, Charles tells him to stop training for the day and takes him to visit one of his dear friends. This is when Scott meets Jean. When they reach Jean's residence, a man named John greets them, and he tells them that Charles' old friend Eric came to visit her and scared her her, which was causing the cars outside her house to float. Charles tells them that Eric has now become Magneto, and he is looking to recruit an army of mutants, and he wishes to include Jean. He tells John that he needs more time with Jean, and his weekly visits are not enough. He also thinks Jean should stay at the Institute so that he can protect her, and Jean agrees. Charles and Magneto then get into a confrontation over Jean, and Magneto accuses that Charles is suppressing Jean's powers and not utilizing her true potential. Charles claims that this is because he sees her as a human being and not as a weapon. Magneto then attacks Charles and the X-Men, and just as they are being overpowered, Scott loses his eyewear. Magneto tries to kill him, but Jean intervenes and telepathically tells Scott to open his eyes. She helps Scott control his powers and then they manage to defeat Magneto. Magneto tells Charles that Jean is more powerful than he realized, and Charles retorts that he has taught her to control her powers. Magneto believes that he can change the world. Emma tells Scott that Jean has taken all his pain away and asks him what happened, to which Scott responds, Wolverine. His memories then cut to the time Wolverine became a part of the X-Men. Wolverine displays interest in Jean from the get-go and asks Charles about her. Wolverine attempts to flirt with Jean, but she rejects his advances and tells him that the professor will help him. Scott tells Wolverine to leave, but Wolverine refuses. Emma believes that Jean found Wolverine intriguing. Scott and Wolverine later get into a scuffle, but Wolverine doesn't fight Scott back, no matter what he does. Jean interrupts them and reprimands Scott, and tells him the only reason Wolverine wouldn't fight back is because she told him not to. The scene changes once again, and this time, Jean asks Scott to apologize to Wolverine, whose real name is Logan. Suddenly, she and Charles let out screams of pain as they hold their heads. Scott tells Emma to slow down the memory and rewind, and they finally see that it was not someone attacking the X-Men, but it was Jean herself who was the cause of the explosion. Cyclops Origin. In X-Men Origins, Cyclops, we get a deeper insight into Cyclops' backstory and the events that led him to leading the X-Men. Professor Xavier requests Cyclops to command the X-Men during his departure. Scott first objects to the notion, telling Xavier that he was considering leaving the team. But then, when Xavier reminds him how vital he is, Scott reflects on some of the significant moments in his life. The first experience he recalls is when he, as well as Alex, were compelled to leap from their parents' plane, and he was entrusted with safeguarding his younger brother. He then recalls the moment he ran and hid from the orphanage at the time he first met Xavier. Finally, he recounts his discussion with Magneto when they first met at the military compound Cape Citadel. It was here that he discovered what a truly evil mutant is. After much deliberation, he informs Xavier that he would assume command, with the condition he will follow his own judgments rather than Charles. Cyclops' amazing storylines from X-Men movies. In the original timeline, in X-Men Origins Wolverine, Scott makes his first appearance in Spanish class at high school. The lecturer instructs him to sit straight and take his glasses off while he's fiddling with them, to which he answers that he has a headache and receives detention. When in detention, Sabretooth taps on the window. After being pursued through the corridors, he attempts to flee, but is quickly caught and his glasses come off, prompting him to release his optic blast, which destroys 3 floors of the building, only to be stopped by Sabretooth. William Stryker then approaches him and injects him with a sedative. He is imprisoned alongside Emma and other juvenile mutants in Stryker's mutant prison compound. His and their combined might is utilized to overpower Stryker's lethal weapon, also known as Weapon XI, or Deadpool. Wolverine wields his claws to smash all the cages containing the young mutant inmates while in the complex to murder Stryker and Sabretooth. Scott and the other mutants leave the facility. He is taken by a telepathic message in his brain to a tunnel outside, where the mutants are welcomed by Charles Xavier, who is now waiting inside a helicopter. Scott, as well as the mutants, attend Xavier's School for the Gifted, and Scott develops a strong relationship with him, viewing him as a dad and mentor. Scott and Emma, Silver Fox, get close as well, until she finally leaves the school to travel the globe. Scott ultimately meets Jean Grey and develops a romance with her. He also finds and becomes friends with Storm and Beast, and becomes both the X-Men's field leader and an instructor at Xavier's school. In X-Men, the film released in 2000, Scott and Storm are dispatched to save Logan, as well as Rogue from the clutches of Sabretooth, who has been dispatched by Magneto. Scott unleashes his beams to free Rogue, who is trapped within Wolverine's caravan. Storm and Cyclops then seize Rogue and Wolverine and get them straight to Xavier's school. Logan's rescuers arrive after he escapes the infirmary and enters a class taught by Professor X. Xavier presents them as Storm and Cyclops, Scott Summers and Aurora Monroe, respectively. Xavier informs Logan that they rescued him, and Jean walks in. Xavier greets her as well, and therefore informs Logan that he is safe from Magneto at his institute for gifted youngsters, mutants. Xavier then informs Logan that he might be able to assist him in determining who he is. Xavier tells Logan telepathically that it has been 15 years since he lost his memories, demonstrating that his telepathy may assist Logan in remembering his history. Logan, intrigued, inquires about the site. After conducting experiments on Wolverine, Jean informs Professor X, Cyclops, and Storm of her findings. Adamantium, a theoretically unbreakable metal, has been welded to his whole skeleton. Cyclops questions Xavier about what he believes Magneto wants from him, and Xavier answers he's not exactly sure. Later that evening, Scott overhears Wolverine attempting to get Jean to read his mind. She departs, and Scott tells Logan to keep away from Jean. A while later, Rogue uses her abilities to absorb Wolverine's healing factor when he accidentally stabs Rogue in the chest and cries out for aid. Aurora, Jean, Scott, and a few youngsters arrive just in time to witness her injuries heal before Logan passes out. Jean and Scott run to rescue Logan, and Rogue begins to apologize and claim that everything was a mistake. Storm describes Rogue to the ticket agent, but before he can even tell Storm if he saw her, Sabretooth appears, shocks everyone, grabs her neck, lifts her, and growls. Cyclops comes to her aid, but Toad, who is hanging to the wall, shoots out his strong tongue and removes Cyclops' eyepiece, causing him to fire a massive optic blast at the ceiling, accidentally blasting a hole through it. As Scott closes his eyes, everyone runs wildly. The next morning, Xavier and Cyclops attempt to work out what Magneto needs with Wolverine in the mansion's basement. Scott dislikes Logan, according to Xavier. Xavier, Jean, Aurora, Scott, and Logan reach a secure room a few moments later, and Xavier invites Logan to Cerebro. Cerebro is a large spherical chamber connected to the machine via a bridge. Xavier says that Cerebro enhances his abilities, letting him monitor mutants across long distances. Xavier follows Rogue and dispatches Cyclops and Storm to locate her. Scott and Aurora are about to leave the garage when Scott sees that his motorbike has disappeared. Back at the mansion, Senator Kelly arrives, and Professor Xavier scans the senator's mind regarding Magneto's invention. Magneto utilizes a machine that emits radiation, causing mutations in regular humans. Xavier realizes that the contraption was powered by Magneto and nearly killed him. Magneto, he deduces, wants Rogue to take in his strength so she may do it in his stead, enabling him to survive. Professor X later becomes poisoned when utilizing Cerebro as a result of Mystique messing with it. Meanwhile, Jean decides to take matters in her own hand and uses Cerebro. Even though Scott tries to stop her, she finds out where Magneto is going. Cyclops, Jean, Storm, and Wolverine organize their battle strategy, they thoroughly knowing Magneto's goal now, and they realize Magneto is unaware that his machine can kill. Scott's first instruction is for them to don one of Scott's old outfits before joining the others aboard the X-Jet. They battle a swarm of Magneto's minions before Magneto comes and reveals his motives. They start fighting again, and Cyclops sees an opportunity and decides to seize it, blasting Magneto and allowing Wolverine to smash Magneto's contraption and save everyone in New York. In X2, X-Men United, Jean starts experiencing difficulties using her powers and has nightmares and headaches, and she feels like something terrible is about to happen. But Scott assures her he will not let anything happen to her. They go to the food court and see that a mutant has attacked the White House. The X-Men debate the strike on the White House subsequently in Xavier's study in the Institute. Magneto, Cyclops believes, is behind it. Xavier informs them that once he knows where the mutant is, he wishes Jean and Aurora to take him up. Summers later accompanies Xavier into Eric Lensher's plastic jail, where Charles wants to confront Eric about the White House attack, but but gets into a scuffle with Lady Deathstrike. But Yuriko appears and takes Summers and Xavier to Alkali Lake, which is William Stryker's facility. Stryker makes Scott wait for the X-Men after brainwashing him. He locates Magneto, Mystique, and Jean, and although under mind manipulation, prepares to fire at Magneto and Mystique from a crossing corridor. Jean uses her powers to send Scott to a level lower and redirects one of his optic shots with a telekinetic blast. In a hallway, Jean realizes they've arrived too late, and both she and Scott shriek and fall to their feet as the Dark Cerebro takes effect. Magneto ultimately succeeds in opening the doors while Cerebro ceases to function. Cyclops prepares to blow Cerebro's doors when Jean informs him that now that the professor is linked to Cerebro, and that opening the door will destroy him and everyone else's whose mind he is linked to. After Nightcrawler and Storm successfully rescue Xavier, the mutants flee to the snow. Magneto has already grabbed the helicopter, much to their dismay. Rogue's plane appears out of nowhere, whirling erratically in the air. Xavier tells Scott on the plane that they have to go to Washington since this is out of their league. The jet loses power and the water bursts out of the dam again, unable to withstand the strain. Jean discreetly exits, unseen by anyone. Logan and Scott are startled when Xavier discovers her actions and yells her name. Logan and Scott race to the exit as Xavier says she's outside. Jean locks the door telekinetically, trapping him within, and starts the jet. Scott orders Aurora not to take off, but Jean does that for her. Scott stands there in agony as Logan instructs Kurt to go fetch her, but Kurt says she won't let him. Jean uses telepathy to speak via Xavier's voice as her final words of goodbye, stating that she understands what she is doing. Scott is greatly upset and enraged as he joins Professor X, Storm, Iceman, Rogue, Nightcrawler, and Wolverine in breaking into the White House to speak with President Obama and avoid a mutant and human conflict, and they complete their mission in the White House successfully. Scott is glancing out the window in Xavier's study. Xavier claims that even as a student, Jean was always cautious about her abilities, always turning to others, fearful that she might be left behind in some manner. Scott wonders, choked up, and asks whether they may have done something to help her, and Xavier believes she may have allowed them to in the past. Logan informs Scott how Jean actually made a decision, and it was Scott. Scott turns away, not finding any solace in this. Scott slips into a severe depression months after Jean's death, disregarding his obligations as a professor and an X-Man. Scott sits on his bed in the dark. His mind is tortured by memories of Jean's tragic death at Alkali Lake. He calls out her name and hears her reply in his brain. A person emerges from the light. Scott looks up, perplexed, as Jean Grey appears in front of his stunned eyes. When she speaks his name, he is taken aback and asks her how this is happening. She removes his eyewear, but he covers his eyes, still afraid of harming her. She instructs him to open them. His eyes first flash red, and yet no optic beams are fired. The crimson light then gradually fades, and his eyes are seen in their normal color. Scott visits the place where Jean died, filled with distress, and shoots an optic blast into the water, where a whirlpool begins to form. Professor X senses something wrong, and sends Logan and Storm to look for him, but they can only find his eyewear. They bring Jean to the mansion, and they can sense something about her is different. Logan shows her Scott's eyewear and asks her what happened. Jean recalls how she got out of the lake earlier and spotted Scott. She shuts her eyes as the entire room starts to tremble, and the glasses in Logan's hand shatter. Storm and Professor X arrive at the clinic, where Logan informs them that he believes Jean murdered Scott, but Storm denies this. A long time later, in the mansion's main lawn, Storm and Kitty stand in front of Scott Summers and Jean Grey's graves, which are close to Xavier's. 3 huge losses, which the X-Men are left to lament. There is also a revised timeline, according to X-Men Apocalypse. Scott is at school in 1983, studying about the Paris tragedy. His eyes begin to trouble him throughout his class, causing him discomfort. Alex Summers, Scott's elder brother, goes home at the assistance of their parents, who inform him about the events at school. Alex then transports Scott to St. Xavier's School. He is compelled to wear a blindfold at school to prevent his powers from emerging. He runs into Jean Grey, forcing her books to all fall down, which she catches in air using her telekinesis. He encounters Charles Xavier, who describes the school to him. Charles instructs Scott to unleash his skills, and Scott, ignorant of how powerful they are, blows apart a tree planted by Charles' grandpa. Alex encourages Scott to be polite while he's away, and Charles later tells him in the car that Scott reminds him of a younger Alex. While at school, Scott befriends pupil Kurt Wagner and Jubilee, both of whom have unrestrained powers, as well as Jean Grey. Scott is grateful to Hank McCoy for making him special ruby quartz eyeglasses that will mask his powers. Cyclops later realizes that his brother was murdered when Apocalypse demolishes the X-Mansion. When William Stryker and his soldiers come, they take Charles, Moira, Hank, and Raven. Scott and his friends sneak onto the helicopter transporting the kidnapped mutants and fly to Alkali Lake. When the three arrive at the facility, they run upon Logan, who is Weapon X, and has already gone through the entire adamantium procedure, and they free him. When Scott bursts through the confines of their prison, the three go to rescue Moira, Hank, Peter, and Raven. The group flees on one of Stryker's planes, donning war suits before flying to Cairo. Jean concludes that Apocalypse will transfer his essence into Xavier and believes they must save him in order to stop Apocalypse. While Mystique as well as Quicksilver try to persuade Magneto to stop him, Storm and Psylocke are defeated by Cyclops, Jean, and Beast. Apocalypse's corporeal body is fought by Cyclops and Beast, as well as a reformed Storm with Magneto, who has experienced a change of heart. Cyclops unleashes his full optic beam on Apocalypse, but he is unable to pierce his force shield. The tremendous strength of Apocalypse proves too much, until Jean appears, as she has now unlocked the might of the Phoenix and joins the battle, vaporizing Apocalypse. Scott and his friends return home as Jean and Magneto restore the mansion. Hank approaches Scott with something like a visor in hand, ready to change his glasses. He has developed special technology on it that allows Scott to adjust the power of his beam, which Scott appreciates, but hopes no one calls him Cyclops. Scott, together with Jean Grey, Storm, Beast, Nightcrawler, and Quicksilver, create the new X-Men, who are dressed in bright new costumes.
Scott, glasses on!
Interesting facts. The family tree of Cyclops is quite intricate. He has another brother, Vulcan, in addition to his mutant brother, Alex Summers. Adam X, a creation of the extreme age of the 90s, was recently discovered to be the fourth Summers brother. Adam X was mentioned as a possible Summers back then, although he was never proved to be one before falling out of favor. Cyclops has typically been the X-Men's field leader, but he has not been the one and only. He once challenged Storm for the honor of leading the squad in possibly one of the most exciting X-Men confrontations. When Jean Grey dies at the climax of the Dark Phoenix saga, her lover Cyclops astonishes the X-Men by encountering and marrying Madeline, who resembles Jean. It proves to be no coincidence, as she is revealed later to be a replica of Jean Grey made by Mr. Sinister. Scott has a close relationship with his mother-in-law, Elaine Grey, who is a mother figure to him. Even after Jean Grey dies, the two remain close. Scott Summers' actions throughout his marriage with Madeline may not be ideal, but when he assassinates Professor X at the conclusion of the Avengers and X-Men crossover story, it isn't clearly his best behavior. One of the most devastating deaths in Marvel Comics is that of Cyclops' beloved mentor. It was initially stated that Cyclops' parents died in an aircraft crash when he was a child, but it was shown in Uncanny X-Men number 154 that Scott's actual father is Corsair, a galactic pirate and part of the Starjammers. The Summers clan is multi-generational in its complexities. Cyclops' children are both from the far future, but from completely different timelines. The first one is Rachel Summers, who initially came from the futuristic world of the Days of Futures Past plotline. Nathan Summers, his son with Madeline Pryor, is contaminated with a techno-organic viral infection and transported to the future to be cured. Mr. Sinister's obsession with the Summers children has put him at the center of comic book culture for decades. Cyclops has become a much colder and more vicious persona after murdering Professor X. His activities propel him into a role of an anti-hero, as his aggressive and often cruel tactics frighten his allies and friends. Cyclops was inspired by superheroes such as Captain America and Iron Man. Cyclops and Emma Frost, also known as the White Queen, have had one of the most surprising relationships in X-Men comics. Although Emma's behaviors are sometimes seen as deceptive, she does appear to really care about Scott, and the two remain together over a long period until Jean returns to the comics. In the 1990s, Cyclops would come and go from the X-Men. One of his most notable exits resulted in the founding of X-Factor, a group made up of the 5 original X-Men. When it was determined that Jean Grey was still alive in 1986, the team reassembled. What makes him so powerful? Cyclops is a mutant with the ability to generate enormous beams of heatless, explosive force from his eyeballs. Cyclops continuously takes ambient light into his cells, and his body metabolizes the energy to open the holes. The mind of Cyclops creates a psionic barrier that is turned into the very same force that keeps the apertures open. This barrier surrounds his body, shielding his own strength. The psionic field of Cyclops' mind governs the breadth of his optic blast. The ultimate force of Cyclops' beam is unknown, but they have been proven to punch holes through mountains. And he's been shown puncturing steel plates and disintegrating solid rock. Cyclops is said to only utilize a portion of his tremendous potential energy production. His more potent optic blasts are capable of destroying fully armored vehicles, seriously damaging sentinels and obliterating whole icebergs. Cyclops has an amazing gift for spatial geometry, which improves his perception of items around him and all angles detected between their surfaces. This innate skill allows him to bounce and reflect his optic beams off things in a trajectory of his choosing. He has been spotted reflecting his blast off half a dozen distinct surfaces during a single optic blast, accurately striking several targets. As a byproduct of their family genetic coding, Cyclops is impervious to the consequences of his own power, as well as his brother Havoc's abilities. Cyclops' ultimate form discussed. Scott Summers becomes Professor Xavier's first pupil in Ultimate X-Men, and stands up to his mentor's purpose of fostering cooperation between humans and mutants developed as the X-Men, which he serves with Jean. Despite her brief affair with Logan, Cyclops is finally able to express his affection and begins a romance with Marvel Girl, his relationship hampered by Jean's Phoenix Force link. After being mercilessly trounced by the mighty Alpha Flight, who had come to recapture wayward member Northstar, the team discovers that much of their adversary's powers came from the narcotic Banshee. The X-Men get divided into 2 factions, those who oppose any use of the drugs, and those who want to use the drugs to destroy Alpha Flight and save Northstar. When Colossus is dismissed from the X-Men after his past with Banshee is exposed, he covertly establishes his own squad of Banshee-enhanced X-Men, which includes Cyclops, who works as a secret spy for Xavier, and Jean in the hopes of uncovering the drug supply. Although he feigns his first Banshee injection, Cyclops opts to inject himself with it for real in order to save his friends from losing another battle against Alpha Flight. Cyclops is thrilled at the benefits of Banshee's power increase in Ultimate X-Men number 95, no longer needing his characteristic spectacles or visor to focus his power. Scott has superhuman abilities, like flight, thanks to the sun's energy coursing through his body, and even gaining the ability to interact with Jean in her Phoenix form.
I'm taking it.
Where else has he appeared? Tim Pocock plays a younger version of Cyclops in X-Men Origins Wolverine. In the film, he is abducted by Sabretooth and forced into the Weapon X experiment before being freed by Charles Xavier and liberated by Wolverine. A young child in red glasses may be seen briefly in X-Men First Class. As a useful, Charles Xavier activates Cerebro for the first time. Some believe the youngster is supposed to be Cyclops. James Marsden makes a brief appearance in the X-Men Days of Future Past climax, recreating his performance from many years ago. Wolverine discovers Scott as well as Jean alive and working as instructors at the Xavier Institute in the new present, with Scott seeming aloof once again after seeing Wolverine. Tay Sheridan plays a young Cyclops in X-Men Apocalypse. Rather than being the older brother, this iteration of Cyclops is Havoc's younger brother, Alex Summers. Cyclops was voiced by George DiZenzo and Neil Ross in 2 segments of Spider-Man Spider-Man and his amazing friends. Cyclops is the captain of the X-Men team and is also in a romance with Jean Grey in the animated series X-Men. He finds out that he is Corsair's son during an X-Men operation to free Polaris from the X-Factor. He also battles his brother Alex. Pride of the X-Men, a debut episode for a TV program that has never picked up, featured Cyclops. Michael Bell provided his voice. In X-Men Evolution, a teen version of Cyclops serves as the team's leader. He also appears in the Marvel anime X-Men and the Superhero Squad show. Cyclops is an experienced X-Men member who had a long romance with Jean Grey and Wolverine in the X-Men. Cyclops' voice was done by Nolan North. Cyclops appears as one of the superheroes during Captain America's media briefing in the first episode of Marvel Disc Wars, The Avengers. Scott Summers, known for his distinctive red visor and forceful leadership, has been a staple of the Marvel Universe from his debut. Scott was a protege of Professor Xavier and the unquestioned leader of Charles' super team, the X-Men. Scott's optic rays were only controlled by a ruby quartz crystal helmet, which inspired Scott's moniker, Cyclops. Cyclops' helmet and characteristic red optic blast are well known to Marvel fans worldwide. But Scott is much more than that. Cyclops displays his usefulness as an asset on several occasions, not just because of what he can accomplish with his optic blast, but also because of what he can achieve without them. And if you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone.